All right, well, I guess we're going to go ahead and get started here. Just a few words while you still have the opportunity, I guess. Not to set a bad precedent here, but this is a very lighthearted talk, a very kind of, I've got a lot of interesting kind of notes and things like that, but if you're looking for something that's very deep and profound, maybe this isn't the best place. It's the end of the conference, the last hour, so I wanted to kind of keep it open and kind of fluid. So very lighthearted, kind of whimsical at times. Certainly not without some nuggets of knowledge in there, but if that's what you're looking for, then you're in the right place, and we should actually even wrap a little early if I can help it. So, with that being said, my name is Kevin Hoyt, and I'm an evangelist with Adobe. Been with the company for 13 years. And my job currently is focused around emerging technology. This is the kind of specifically for when it comes to Adobe, this is the intersection between creativity and things that are new technologies that are emerging. So for example, you might have seen the Leap motion controller out there on the exhibit floor, for example. It's a bunch of infrared things that you can move your hand around in kind of 3D space in front of you, and things happen on the screen. Like what impact does that have to a designer's workflow? What does that ultimately mean, in my specific circumstance, to Adobe's tooling? Should we have support for it? Should we do something more with it? So that's the area I spend a lot of time playing with, trying to figure out what that means to Adobe and what we can do with it, or if we just should avoid it in general. If you want to reach me, the best way to reach me is KR Hoyt on Twitter. I know everybody says that, but emails and other things like that, especially at a conference like this where it tends to be kind of back-to-back, I'll skip over a lot of things and just head straight to Twitter. So if you have any questions about the presentation, want the slides, just want to know my further thoughts on anything, feel free to go ahead and let me know on Twitter, KR Hoyt. So I actually have 5 overall things, but I hesitated to really put them down into individual, just strictly 5 individual elements, and so I've kind of break them down a little bit as well. So the first point that I would like to make about designers and developers is that design and development are both processes. So if you look at the work that goes in for a design, I think the design occurs predominantly on the front side of that process, and development occurs predominantly on the back side of that process, if you will. But it is still a process. We still go through the same kind of things. And so specifically I wanted to call out patterns, simplicity, and clarity. This is straight out of the Apple Human Interface Guidelines. So if you're looking to design a phone application for iOS, this is one of the things you'll find in the very first page of the introduction, even today. It's actually been there for a long time, but it even goes today. The idea that good product design incorporates a number of timeless principles. And so these are different patterns that designers use to appropriately elicit the correct interaction from the user. Developers actually go by the same thing. Developers have what they call design patterns, and design patterns in a developer world, this is called the Gang of Four. You can talk to any developer about the Gang of Four. Most often they will know about this book. Many of them will have read it. It goes back to 1994. These are patterns. These are timeless patterns, just like the Human Interface Guidelines that it mentions that good design is based on timeless patterns. Same thing happens. Good code is based on timeless patterns. The problems that we often look to solve as developers have been solved before, and usually they've been iterated on since then, and they can be solved in more efficient ways than we can think of with only our individual intelligence. So reaching into an array of patterns can prove us more productive as developers, just as an array of patterns can prove you more productive as a designer to elicit the appropriate response from your user. From a simplicity perspective, this is, I have a hard time deciding between the next two. This one is simplicity, the next one is clarity. And they seem really closely related, and I think they are. In fact, you can find a lot of different resources about designing simple and clear. but there's a subtle kind of semantic shift to them. So here, John Maeda, who's kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with John Maeda, he's effectively the father of motion interactive motion graphics and animation, so he kind of knows what he's talking about. He states that simplicity is about subtracting the obvious and adding the meaningful. Subtracting the obvious, adding the meaningful, okay? From a programmer standpoint, we do the same thing, try to make things more simple. And we do that usually, in this case, there are lots of different ways we do it to make things more simple. This is one of the ways that I see most commonly is through the means of changing how we write our code. So for example, the while loop you see on your left would be how kind of most general programmers would write this particular piece of code. While something is true, do this, blah, blah, blah. The kind of alternative way to write that, however, would be while something is true, blah, blah, blah. Same statement, but you notice there's a few different things there. One is that 3 calls get combined into 1, and there's actually a lack of any curly braces here. And if you ever talk to a developer about simplicity and readability of code, you'll run into the curly brace issue all the time. Where they are, if they're on the same line, if they're on a different line, if there are spaces between them or not, and things like that. So the same functional code, but written very different in order to make the code more simple. Right? If I have to change something, I no longer have to change blah and change blah and change blah. I can just change blah, 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 so making it more simple. The bottom one, I think, is interesting because it's simple, not so much from a development perspective for readability, but simple for its use case. So most developers on the left will write something like a for loop that looks like this. For I equals 0, as long as I is less than 8, keep doing this. And so it does something, in this case, 8 times. An integer in the developer world is 32 bytes, generally speaking. There are longer ones and shorter ones, but generally speaking, you're looking at 32 bytes, or 32 bits, which is 4 bytes. So that takes up 4 bytes to keep track of how many times you're iterating. When I talk about like interacting with the Leap motion controller and various kind of embedded electronics and interactive installations, when you get down to the microcontroller, 4 bytes can actually mean quite a bit, especially if you're using a lot of integers. On a computer, it doesn't really matter. You have so much memory, it doesn't matter. But a good way to simplify for an environment that is really restricted, in this case, is I equals 0x8000. And what it's actually doing then at the very last one, it wrapped it on this screen, that's kind of weird, but the last one says I, and it's got these kind of greater than equals. It's actually bit shifting. So instead of using 4 bytes, it's using 1 byte, which still allows me to represent the number 8, but it allows me to do it in a very compact, very efficient way. Is that simple? Is that more simple to read? I don't know, but developers will obsess about these things. So when you think about simplicity in your designs, developers clearly think about simplicity in their code as well. Clarity. I hesitated to put a different quote in here, another quote by Michael Hoffman actually, but he can be kind of brutal at times. He suggests that simplicity is really dumbing down, while clarity is making things intuitive. I chose instead to go with the idea that the most important goal of effective communication is clarity. That would be the design side, and we can see this if you're a user and you're trying to design a user interface. You look at something like Microsoft Word and the ribbon, and there is so much up there, it's just a disaster. Oddly enough, it actually tests really well if you do the research on it. But compare that to something like Pages, which is designing, is this more simple or is it more clear? I would argue that it's not more simple because it really didn't dumb anything down, it just made it more intuitive. You see the difference between simplicity and clarity? And so in this case, right, this is much easier to parse from a visual standpoint. When we're designing, we often will think about, again, that clarity aspect of it. Developers think about clarity as well. Often developers will think about clarity in terms of parameterization, the clarity of their code, right? So the first line here is an example from Python. You'll notice the square brackets. The square brackets indicate things that are optional, things that I don't necessarily have to pass along to get this particular call in my code to work. So this opens a file. It could be opened for reading or writing, and it could be buffered into some chunk of memory, but at the very least, I need to know what I'm going to read and write. So parameterization allows us to make more clarity in how our functionality is accessed. This can backfire sometimes, and I'll show you that in a minute. But for the next line, there's PHP, which is a very similar approach to open a file. It's fopen, file name and mode. It says, you know, mode is required. We're going to be either reading, or we're going to be writing it, or we're going to be appending to it, or something along those lines. So it requires that. It actually then offers an alternative of where that file is located via path. Java, which can be particularly verbose for programmers at times. If you're looking at, most programmers will not look at Java as a simple language or a clear language, really, just because there's so much going on to accomplish any one thing. So I just chose to look at what we call the constructors, or how the process gets started, if you will. So Java here says that to give me a new file. The difference here is that PHP and Python both don't have what we call strong data types. They're very loose. File name is just a string that we pass along, a bunch of characters strung together to make something. Java actually considers a file a proper thing, and it objectifies that and puts that in here. And so you can actually pass it a file, or you can pass it a string. So when you have data types, it really simplifies when I'm trying to read that, what I'm doing. Simplification, though, can come back and bite us, and clarity can come back and bite us. So parameterization clarity through parameterization. The last one is jQuery. This is an AJAX call in jQuery. You can pass it what's called a configuration object, and then you can say, oh, well, it accepts this. It's an asynchronous or synchronous call. Before you send it, do this. Use the cache. Keep it in cache if it's not there. Pass some contents. It goes on and on and on and on and on and on. Like, that's parameterization to an extreme. And that would not seem so clear, but when you actually go to use it, it's very clear, because jQuery has this kind of fundamental thought from a developer perspective that it's going to keep it clear by assuming something for everything. And so when you call jQuery, it generally has a default, or it assumes some value for everything. And then you just are tweaking the ones that you want to change. And that makes it very clear when you actually go to use it. All the parameters can be kind of overwhelming, but at the end, when you go to use it, actually makes it very clear. All my stuff's getting concatenated. That's horrible. All right, well, anyway, the second point. So the first one is all about patterns and simplicity and clarity. The second one here is that code is art. When I look at a piece of code that I wrote 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, I look at that, and a lot of times we'll be like, "Whoa, that's nasty." Sometimes I'll look at the code I wrote last week and say, "Ooh, that's nasty." But developers are very much like artists in that sense, right? The code is our clay. It allows us to sculpt it and move it and push it in new directions to make it into things that we want to, in the end, deliver. As it turns out, though, as I find out, especially when I play around with things like the Leap controller or other types of interaction devices that are emerging, artists can actually be like developers as well, and I'll point that out as well. So when we take a look at the first one, we're going to go to abstract thinking. So designers are thinking abstracts. Right? You walk up to a canvas, you're going to paint something, it's abstract at this point. You have to look at it, figure out what it represents to you, what's in your mind's eye, and how to deliver that using the tools and techniques that you are familiar with onto that canvas. It's a very abstract process. So developers, actually, same thing. I know this doesn't look abstract, but this is a blank iPhone application. What now? What do I do now? Well, I have to use the tools and techniques and approaches that I've been trained to use, and try to build something and make something out of this into what in the end I want to. So very similar to painting in that respect. A new project is just like a blank canvas. So abstract thinking is a very important part of development. Refinement happens as well, obviously in the design process. On the left here is a painting done by Picasso. I'll reference Picasso and Da Vinci a number of different times throughout the presentation. This is the one on the left is done by Picasso. It turns out that he didn't like this, and so he refined it. He changed it. He painted over it and made something different. And that's what we actually see on the right, which is his woman ironing, which is one of his more famous pieces. So this is they're both Picasso, but he's refined it. He saw something different in that abstract canvas, and he decided to deliver on a different experience. And developers will do the same thing. We call this refactoring in the programmer world, in the developer world, where we see something and we revisit the code, and we want to change it up again and retouch it and modify it to reflect what we've learned along the way. So designers and developers are very similar in that respect. I think something that goes kind of along with this is inspiration. And again, I'm referencing more Picasso here, but great artists copy, or good artists copy, great artists steal. Da Vinci, Last Supper. So in the design world, turns out we get inspiration from places like this. This is Warhol's Last Supper. Okay. This is actually technically a commentary on Christ and commercialism, which is an interesting take. But obviously he's pulling from the Last Supper that Da Vinci did, right? So we, as designers, you find this, you find inspiration from various places, and you iterate on that inspiration, and you deliver your own content, and it may directly or indirectly steal from that content, as Picasso mentioned. Developers do the same thing. We call this open source, though. So when we say fork me on GitHub, you might see this all over different libraries. The idea here is, I've written something, steal it, make it better, improve it, do more to it, or do something completely different. At the very least, contribute to the conversation. Let's get things going, and very much like you would do between talking about the differences between Da Vinci's Last Supper and Warhol's Last Supper. You would have a conversation, and we continue the conversation in this case of how Christ is involved in commercialism. In this case, right, we're talking about continuing the conversation. Take the code, change it, make it, do something better to it, give it back to me, give it back to the project, and do stuff with it. It may or may not be accepted, and we can talk about that and see how this impacts the overall project. So open source is actually a means by which we borrow inspiration from other developers. Design and development both require deep concentration. T. Lawrence, happiness as absorption. I like that. You've ever been in a situation where where hours and minutes slip by and you don't even notice it? This is actually a phenomenon that's been more recently documented as flow. Generally speaking, you might think of it as the term of in the zone, right? So when you approach, for example, that blank canvas, and you're going to make a painting, and you have this vision in your mind's eye, and you go to deliver that vision, you start picking up the brushes and painting, and before long you kind of got something going, and you reach for more colors, and then more colors, and then you start changing the way the textures go, and you keep going and going, and you look up at the clock, and you realize that half the day just went by. Same thing happens with developers, and you see this pretty often, I imagine, in most corporate workplaces in America anyway. Put on the headphones, and whatever it is you're listening to, you can be working that to get in the zone, to flow, to be totally absorbed in the activity that you're doing. That is something that is common to both design and development. Another way this manifests is that programmers are organisms that turn caffeine and pizza into software. All right. So I think kind of the inverse of this, the inverse of being so involved in something that time slips by and becomes a non-factor, the inverse of this would be so stuck on an idea that you can't get it out of your head, and you keep revisiting it over and over and over and over and over until you finally get it right the way you want it to be. This is the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa was done over 14 years, so they say. Clearly the guy had something in his head and he just couldn't get it out. And you find this in design, but when we talk about Da Vinci, not only was he an artist, but he was also a scientist. This is his aerial screw. It's also what's commonly referred to as a helicopter. So Da Vinci actually is one of the early inventors and contributors to that conversation of what a helicopter is. He's also, besides being a scientist, he's also an engineer. This is a means for transporting troops, military troops, across the battlefield safely. It's otherwise what we call today a tank. Again, early contribution to that idea, and some might even say that he invented the tank and the helicopter. So I think the point being here is that you think about design and development as different things, but really they're so closely related that some of the greats do both. They do both equally well. And I think that's because of a mental model, right? They have this mindset that, oh, I'm a designer, or oh, I'm a developer. And labels, we'll talk about labels here. Actually, we'll table that for. We'll talk about little labels here in a minute. Anymore, in any kind of museum installation, you see more and more combinations of multiple disciplines. So this is an installation called Frequency and Volume. And the idea behind this installation is that as you move around in the installation and change the various shadows, it changes the frequencies and the tones and the volumes of the noises that the installation makes. And in the end, you're kind of generating it yourself. But to do this, right, you have to have not only design skills, but you also have to have development skills. There's some code in there and figuring out how to make the sensors work and put it all together. And so the intersection of art and development, or design and development, is actually a very common place to be playing these days, especially, and this is something that we share in common. If we step back and look at designers and developers, not so much from the different aspects I've characterized so far, and really just think about it from a business perspective, there are things that we should both be able to do. I put down here, this is a shortened version, and some of you might pick this up, but this is a shortened version of characterization, hypothesis, and experiment. There's an interesting, and if you're a designer and you're interested in kind of reading this particular link, I've simplified it here. It actually comes across pretty blunt, pretty kind of holier than thou on developers. So take it with a grain of salt. I've distilled it a bit, and I've rated it as framing the problem, capitalizing opportunity, finding meaning, refining the patterns, exploring them, and collaborating. And when I read that initially, I thought, well, first, this guy's kind of forward. But then the second thing I thought is, you know what really that is? It's ask a question, do research, construct a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, analyze the data, and report the results. Anybody recognize that? It's a scientific method, exactly. So this is something that both designers and developers should be able to do in a business setting. We should both be able to understand the scientific method, despite its name, as a method for achieving a result. Result in this case that may be business driven, but it could certainly apply to other places as well. So those are things, unlike those are things that we both have in common, those are things we both should have in common. Developers are funny. I know that seems odd. Maybe it's a different type of humor, but everybody likes a good laugh, even developers. You can, if you're a designer and you're trying to connect to your developer, make a connection there. Common experiences, accomplishment, or any lack thereof of accomplishment. I'll give you a few points and pieces along the way here. At a HTML conference, this should be pretty readily available. I think whether you're a designer or developer, you can relate to this one, that CSS is awesome. Can I give you a programmer joke here? Why do programmers always mix up Halloween and Christmas? Because oct of 31 is des 25. So what this is playing on is programmers work in different numbering systems. You might have heard of binary. That's a 0 and a 1 numbering system. It's a 2-base. This is oct is an 8-base. Des is a 10-base. Decimal is the system we use in everyday math today. But if you take, actually, let's do this. I come into calculator, put programmer mode here. Say, oh, it's the 25th That's the decimal system. It's a 10-base system. If I turn that into an 8-base system, 31. Right, that's where the joke comes from. And so clearly we work in a different train of thought. Don't tap on the glass. We scare easily. All right, so this is put outside the door by programmers for programmers. It's funny, and I think people can relate to that. So programmers, developers can be funny too. Again, and using their own tools and techniques to describe what they're accomplishing. In this case, they're pregnant. They're very happy about it. They want some cereal. So this is code that describes that for them. If you're a programmer or developer, you'll see this in any kind of, like whether you like the movie or not, or whether the conference is good, or whatever the case may be, you'll see this kind of stuff all over the place. And we use, programming is really just another language, and we use that language to express our thoughts in different ways. This is one that I've encountered personally a few times, but right on one side of the bed, there's a lady, and she's, tonight, husband was acting weird. I thought he was upset. We made a restaurant reservation. I was late. I thought maybe he was mad. He didn't make any comments on it, and the conversation wasn't going. And maybe we went for a walk, and he didn't say anything. But he didn't really seem there. And he got home, and he just watched television. And his thoughts were somewhere else. And I don't know what to do. I'm sure a relationship is over. Well, if you're a developer, on the other side of the bed, you're just thinking, code's broken, can't figure it out. That's my wife has learned, we've been married for 15 years, she's learned when I'm glazing off into space, she knows I'm just working on code in my head. But yeah. Ryan Gosling, gotta have some Gosling. There's a whole website dedicated to Ryan Gosling making weird programmer-esque statements. This is not a pickup line that would probably work very well, but, but there it is. Developer, maybe a more marketing joke, but SEO copywriter walks into a bar, pub, grill, public house, Irish bar, yeah, you get the idea, right? So everybody has, whether you're a designer or developer, you have these common experiences, and you can relate to them on that. Humor is a great bridge to work off of. Another one of my personal favorites, code doesn't work, I have no idea why, and then my code works, and I have no idea why. Yeah. That happens too. So so humor. It's a great tool to get to know your developers and to be able to connect to them on these various processes. The last one, though, I want to come back and circle on is that labels reflect a process. Right? We talked about when I first started. I talked about how design was in the process. The design work is generally in the front of the process, and development work tends to be towards the end of the process. We tend to classify as designers and developers, and labels are necessary. They provide certain values and identification for us in the working environment, but also in life. But remember that they reflect your working process, and they don't define you. I think that's very important. When you think about development, you think about code, you might think, oh, that's hard, it's crazy, I'm never going to understand all that stuff. Well, I don't know, is that maybe a self-fulfilling prophecy? Like, are you telling yourself that you can't really be a developer or can't do it? And likewise, if you're a developer in the room and you say, oh, I could never learn to do that stuff, maybe you can, right? And if you never try, if you never open the door, if you never start learning, never take the challenge to try to do it, then you never will. And I think that's a very important aspect for designers and developers to stop using the labels as kind of a cement brick wall between them and really think about different ways to approach it. Right? You hear about like the guy's a ninja, right? Like, oh, you can code and just crazy stuff happens. Or on the design side, you tend to hear the term rock stars, right? Oh, they cranked out this amazing design. And somewhere in between is the mythical unicorn, right? Right? So I don't want to be that guy, right? But the point is here that you can is that you can actually be both. You know, labels confuse things. Labels are good, they're good sometimes, but they're bad sometimes. And don't get transfixed on them because you can end up in awkward situations when really you can just have a growth mindset. And I think that's kind of the point that I want to make out of a designer and developer talk for both, is that designers and developers can both go the other way. And we talked about the interactive installations, we talked about Vinci, right? We talked about different ways that developers and designers are alike up front. We talk about 10 of them, different ones. But then we talk about how they merge, and in fact, really you can do one or the other. You can do both. That mythical unicorn doesn't have to be you, or you can be that mythical unicorn, I guess. Right, we can get along. We can get along. So I love the look on the girl's face. Is like she's going to kill somebody. She's not happy to be in that situation. But all right, so developers and designers aren't really that different. In fact, one can be the other, and you find people that do exactly that. You can all get along, and so I would encourage you to do that when you think about designers and developers. And with that, I'll thank you for your time.